Writing Out Loud, a program designed to explore in-depth interviews with writers to hear that words have voices.
Hello everyone, I'm Teresa Miller, and our very special guest today is Zakaria, one of the great journalists in our world today. Thank you so much for being here.
It's my pleasure to be here.
And you didn't have to be here. You're actually delaying your flight so you can do this show. I feel like we're right up there with the Daily Show now.
It really is my pleasure. I've had a great time in Tulsa, so I'm delighted to do this.
You're an honorable guy. You're originally from India. Give us a sense of what it was like to grow up in that country.
Well, I didn't know it at the time, but India in the 60s and 70s was probably one of the poorest countries in the world if you look at the numbers. I grew up in a kind of middle-class situation in Bombay, which was then the largest city in India. Went to an English school. My parents were both educated, and so we had this dual existence, a very deep involvement in India. My father was a politician, my mother was a journalist, but still very fascinated by the world outside. We were always interested in what was going on in America. I, for some reason, was very interested in international affairs since I was a kid. I was reading Time and Newsweek and The Economist. I remember reading the excerpts of Henry Kissinger's memoirs when they came out.
Oh,
and
my
I looked
goodness.
back at the date and I realized I must have been 14 at the time.
Oh.
I'm sure I didn't understand it. But I was just always interested in that world. So I grew up in a situation where my parents talked about their work with us all the time. So I was enmeshed in the kind of politics and public debates of India. But I always looked at this bigger canvas out there, which was the United States, and wondered what it would be like. And I think probably like most kids, I was fascinated by America because of the movies and things like that. But for some reason, there was always a deeper attraction for me. I used to go, the U.S. Information Service, which was an arm of the U.S. Embassy, used to do these movie nights where they would show not the movies that showed in the cinema houses, which were the big blockbusters. They'd show the old classics, Casablanca, The Maltese Falcon, It Happened One Night, and I would watch I'd go to those, and it was me and a bunch of aging American expats, but I loved it.
You were born into a Muslim family. What do you think are the most common misconceptions about Islam?
Well, the most common misconception I think about Muslims is that they're all fanatics, or that they're all even deeply religious. I think that for the most part, people who are Muslim, like people anywhere, going about their daily lives, trying to figure out how to educate their children or raise a family, make a good living. And I think that sometimes is lost because there is a small minority that's engaging in this, absolutely horrible and horrendous acts of radicalism. Also, the Islam that existed in India in the 60s and 70s was particularly liberal and secular, so that I had no experience or really no knowledge of the kind of radicalism and extremism that has been spawned. What happened in the world of Islam is the oil boom, because Saudi Arabia used to be regarded as a kind of desert nomadic society with a very puritanical and very unusual version of Islam that was practiced almost nowhere else in the world. Very austere, very xenophobic, very puritanical. Then comes the oil boom. Saudi Arabia suddenly becomes one of the richest countries in the world, and those oil dollars allow for the export of this very narrow, particular version of Islam to the rest of the world. And so that happens in the 70s and 80s. And in many ways, it's one of the tragedies of globalization, because what ended up happening is you globalized this particular radical Islamist ideology that had really been very peculiar to Saudi Arabia and a few places around there.
Were you sitting in a movie theater when you first made the decision to come to America?
No, I'll tell you, I remember how it happened. A friend of ours had, nobody in India went to American universities when I was young. They went to British universities. And then the money started drying up because we all needed scholarships because we
Of
couldn't
course.
afford to pay the fees. The money started drying up from Britain. And the American universities had begun to offer some foreign scholarships. And a friend of mine, a friend of ours, a neighbor, had ended up going to Cornell because his father was posted in New York. He was working for a company that had sent him to New York. And he went to Cornell. He came back from his freshman year in Cornell, and he was telling us stories of life there. And he was explaining how you can take physics and poetry, and he was telling us about these movie societies that existed in Ithaca that were part of Cornell's kind of campus culture. And I thought to myself, my God, this makes education sound so much fun. I didn't know you were supposed to have fun. You know, in India, it was a very regimented kind of education, a lot of cramming, a lot of big exams. And so I was dazzled by it, and I thought, okay, I've got to get there. I've got to find a way to do it. And none of us knew how. Somebody once, told my brother and me, well, there's this thing called the SATs. And you've got to take them. And we said, sure, okay, what do you do? He said, well, it's an aptitude test. You can't study for it. So we said, okay. We just walked into the testing center the day of the exam and took it.
And it obviously did very well. And you began your studies at Yale in this country. Who were some of the American journalists you looked to as mentors?
Oh, gosh. I have so many. I was so lucky. I thought I was going to become an academic. So for much of my early educational life, I was much more interested and involved and engaged with academics. Paul Kennedy, the Yale academic who wrote this book, The Rise and Fall of the Great Powers, he was one of my mentors at Yale. Sam Huntington at Harvard. But I realized that I was interested in journalism because of this. I started a college magazine. I started a magazine in high school. When I got to college, every summer I took a job at a magazine or a newspaper. I worked at Harper's and the Wall Street Journal and the New Republic. But I never thought I was doing this for professional reasons. I just thought I was doing it because it was the most fun jobs you could get. I'd watch my friends who would be paralegals, and they were sitting there Xeroxing stuff. And as a journalist, if you were an intern at the New Republic, they would let you go out and report and write stories. So I thought, well, this is much more fun than Xeroxing. And the people who helped me there were Michael Kinsley, was the editor of the New Republic at the time, a completely brilliant guy who he edited one of the first pieces I ever wrote. And he said to me, I'm going to explain to you once why I'm editing the way I'm editing. I'm never going to do it again because I don't have the time, but you should understand this. And so he edited with notes. I'm deleting this because it's unnecessary, there are too many words. I kept that with me for 20 years because it was the most brilliant example. It was like an applied version of Strunk and White, just how to be precise, how to be concise, how to write clearly. I had a very good stroke of luck when I was in graduate school at Harvard. I got to know Walter Isaacson. And he came to me one day and said, he was then a senior editor at Time, and he said, there's this job opening, managing editor of Foreign Affairs magazine. Would you be interested? And I remember telling him, no, I'm not interested because I've just been offered, or sort of offered, an assistant professorship at Harvard. And he said to me, I'm talking to you about the managing editor job at Foreign Affairs. And I looked at him and I said, yeah, and I'm telling you about an assistant professorship at Harvard. And we realized that we were both, in each of our little universes, the job we were describing was very important. I went back that night and I realized, wait a minute, my whole life I've taken these journalism jobs. Maybe that's telling me something. Maybe I really like journalism. And so I called him up and I said, hey, toss my hat in the ring. And that was how I ended up getting my first job. I applied for the managing editor job, which was a bit of a stretch because I was 28 and most of the people who were being considered were in their 50s.
What are some of the ways you've grown as a writer over the years?
I think that probably the biggest way I've grown, and I don't think that this is true for everyone, I think for many journalists it's the opposite. I've come to realize the importance of telling a story. I tend to think very analytically. Part of it is my training as an academic. I think very logically, very precisely in categories. But most people, I think, want a story. And so what I try to do now is to communicate the ideas that I have, but do them in the form, if I can, of a story. I find a historical episode that illustrates what I'm describing. When I gave the talk at Tulsa, I tried to begin with when I was growing up in India and how the world has changed, rather than doing it in a kind of dry, analytic way. I think that most people can associate themselves, can imagine life as a story, because that's how we live it, you know, chronologically, rather than dividing it up into analytic chapters. So for me, that's probably been the biggest area where I've grown. And the second one I'd say is recognizing that it's a long game, and the most important thing to do is to have the discipline to try to do your best work, but just keep at it. I've now written, I don't know, over 1,000 pieces of serious journalism over 30 years. I know that I've made mistakes here and there, but I think my average is pretty good, and I've tried to keep that in mind, because you can sometimes get down on yourself. You make a mistake somewhere, you wish you had done something differently, and I try to kind of remind myself that the goal here is, keep moving, keep trying to do a good job.
What's the hardest column you ever had to write?
The hardest columns I had to write were right after 9/11. Until then, I had never written anything that said, as a Muslim, as an Indian. I had never brought my identity into anything. I was very proud of that. I was, Harvard PhD in American foreign policy. My dissertation was on the foreign policy of Theodore Roosevelt and Ulysses Grant. I mean, I had done really hardcore research on, core American subjects of foreign policy. I felt like I'd earned my street cred to be able to talk about those kinds of things. But here was a situation where, I could analyze it very clearly and objectively and all that, but I also knew this world, and I knew these cultures, and I knew what it was like to be in those places, because I had grown up, in a sense, in that world. My father was actually a politician, but he was also an Islamic scholar. He had written a lot. He was a very liberal Islamic scholar who believed in bringing Islam into the modern world. And so I felt like, I know this stuff, and how can I not, bring that knowledge and that perspective to bear? So I began by, in very subtle ways, letting people know. So I wrote that 7,000 word piece, Why They Hate Us, for Newsweek, a cover story 2 weeks after 9/11. I wrote it in 2 days. And I had a section in there just about how Islam had changed from the Islam that I grew up with in India to and it was the first time I had ever mentioned myself in a column, in that sense. There was a time when I became an American, and I decided to write a column about it. I had never found that easy to do. I thought I was bringing myself into the story and that I wasn't the story, and I still resist it. I only do it if I feel that it really adds value to the story, because fundamentally a journalist shouldn't be the story. We are meant to be shining a light on what's going on in the world.
You've always taken on tough subjects. Have you ever been controversial by accident in ways that surprise you?
Oh, I've been controversial by accident in ways that people will sometimes go after me. And if you're prominent, you realize that your open season, your fair game for people for all kinds of things.
Is that troubling to you?
Look, I'd be fibbing you if I said it doesn't trouble me. But, one of the things I've tried to do is to have an impact with my ideas. And in order to do that, you do develop a high profile. And there are enormous benefits that come with that. Look at my, this extraordinary opportunity I've had in Tulsa. So I try to keep in mind, I've been very lucky in a lot of ways in life, particularly with my career. And so if I have some bad luck along the way, it still doesn't even it out. I'm still very blessed.
If you had to pick print journalism or broadcast journalism, which would be your platform of choice?
I hope I didn't have to, because I'll tell you, I think that I still learn more by writing. The reason I write my columns and the reason I write books is because that's how I learn about the world. It's because it's only when you actually sit down and try to think through something seriously in a way that you have to write a logical argument. That's when you know when you have flaws, when you have holes, when you have gaps. Walter Lippmann, the great columnist, is supposedly was asked one day, what do you think about some subject? And he said, I don't know what I think about that because I haven't written about it yet. And I think that's true. The act of writing makes you think. And I wouldn't give that up for the world. But as you well know, the power of television is unmatched. The impact that television has is unmatched. And so I feel as though, again, I'm blessed because I've been able to do both things. I have a column in the Washington Post and I have the show, and I'm able to, in a sense, each one feeds off the other.
Oh, and your CNN show has been an enormous success, and it's made, I think, a real difference in the way a lot of us think about things. If you could point to 3 pivotal moments for you personally on the show, what would they be?
Well, certainly the beginning of the show, for sure. Getting it right. No, actually, I'll tell you what was the pivotal moment in the beginning with the show was, I started the show, and I was trying to be, again, very straight and do the format everyone else did, which is interviews and panels. I think Tony Blair was my first guest. And we started getting feedback from the audience saying, wait a minute, we don't just want you to ask questions. We've been reading you for all these years. We want to know what you think. We want to understand. We don't want to just have you in the position of somebody who's just asking the questions. And I thought to myself, well, how do I do that? And so we began devising the show in a way where it allowed me to let people know, here's what I'm thinking about this week. So we open the show with an opening commentary, and then in the middle of the show we do this segment called What in the World, and then at the end of the show we have so we found ways to still to provide the kind of commentary and perspective I can bring, but in a respectful way that didn't detract from the guests. And I'm very conscious of the fact that I try to have on people who disagree with me, and I'll say, well, you just heard what I think about this. Now here's another perspective, or have a panel where there are people who clearly don't share my views. And so that piece of it was very gratifying, to figure out that there was a way that we could do that. The second piece, I'd say, was doing the interview with the Premier of China. The Premier of China had never given an interview to anyone, leave alone to a Western journalist. And he decided, they came to us and said, we've watched the show, we think it's the most serious show around, and this is the show, this is the platform in which we would like the Premier to be heard. And so that was very gratifying. It then proceeded to be a very complicated negotiation, which, my God, I feel like I earned my diplomatic stripes because so many issues had to be ironed out. But that was certainly one of the pivotal ones. I'd say probably the third one, probably interviewing Obama on the campaign trail, which was a lot of fun because you were, to be part of the story, to be part of the process of the picking of the president is something, again, for a kid to grow up in India, to be in that, injected, even in a teeny way, to be injected into that process was just a lot of fun.
We also want to talk about your books. First, The Future of Freedom. What were the major questions you wanted to raise with this book?
The main dilemma or problem I was trying to understand was, this was in the 1990s, that I was seeing around the world democracy at the end of the Cold War flourishing everywhere. Everyone was holding elections. But then you'd turn around and you'd go back to those countries a couple of years later and you'd notice it didn't look like a democracy, it didn't feel like a democracy, it didn't smell like a democracy, and yet they had had a big election. And so I came up with this idea of what I called illiberal democracy. In other words, not liberal democracy, but the opposite, meaning democracy is really two things. One is popular participation, people voting, and that was happening all over the world. But there's another part of democracy which is the liberal part, and here I mean liberal in the old-fashioned sense of the word, meaning pertaining to liberty, the rule of law, the protection of individual rights, the separation of church and state, the protections of freedom of the press. Those didn't exist in these countries. So people were holding elections in Africa, but then the party that would win, or the person that would win, would essentially become an elected dictator. And so I thought, wait a minute, that's not what we really mean by democracy. In the West, we mean, there are two different pieces to it. And it made me think about how the American Constitution, for example, the parts that we revere now, the Bill of Rights, is a specific limitation on democracy, right? What is the Bill of Rights? The Bill of Rights is 10 amendments that say no matter what the majority wants, you cannot abridge freedom of press. You cannot abridge the free expression of religion. You cannot engage in unreasonable search and seizure. So these are all limitations on democracy, and yet, to our mind, that strengthens democracy. So I tried to explain that paradox, that the West means by democracy two things. One is the vote, but the other are all these protections that are actually anti-democratic in their nature. They're saying, I don't care what the majority thinks. And then the rest of the world, they've just taken one of these things, the voting bit. And we need to make them understand that there's a lot, that needs to happen, not just the vote. The Islamic world, and there's a chapter in the book on it, is a perfect example of that, where people will have a vote. Think of Iraq, where they had elections.
Right.
But the Shia majority that came into power systematically then oppressed the Sunni minority. They didn't worry about minority rights, individual rights, none of that. Their feeling was, hey, we won the election, we get to rule now.
And then the post-American world, I wonder if you would address what you refer to as the rise of the rest.
So if you look at the poor countries of the world 20 years ago, they really made up a very, very small part of the global economy. If you were to look at the United States, Europe, Japan, that would have been 85% of the global economy. Today, those poor countries, China, India, Brazil, South Africa, they make up about half the global economy. So that transformation of these countries that were really on the margins economically to the center of the world stage is what I tried to describe. But I tried to describe it's not just an economic story, because once they grow economically, they become politically stable, they become culturally proud, and they become, in foreign policy terms, more assertive and more active. And so what I'm trying to describe in the book is a world in which the United States continues to do fine. The US is, I'm very bullish on the American economy. In fact, the first line of the book is, this is not a book about the decline of America, but rather the rise of everyone else. So America faces a new world. Even though it's doing fine, you can imagine a China that was 1% of the global economy is now 10% of the global economy. And so it says to itself, well, we need to have a much bigger role in the corridors of power, in the big international institutions. A Turkey that used to be a basket case economy that would take orders from Washington now has its own mind, because it's become a $1 trillion economy. It grows fast, it's politically stable, its leaders are popular and effective. And again, they can't be bossed around. So what I'm trying to get Americans to understand is that this is a new world. It's not that you're declining or we're declining. It's that these other countries have grown in economic, political, and cultural terms. They are in a different place. And managing this new world is much more complicated than managing a world in which the US was 50% of the global economy, where Europe was basically made up the rest, and everyone saluted and asked how high when the United States wanted you to jump.
You've written that 2015 may be the year of America. Why America? Why now?
A few things have come together that are making the United States economy particularly very powerful right now. The first is we handle the crisis better than other countries, than other rich countries did. There's now pretty clear, and the evidence is overwhelming. The United States had active monetary policy, it had active fiscal policy, and we got our banks in shape much better than any European countries, and certainly Japan. And so we're cleaned up in a way, in much better shape than the other countries. The second has been the energy revolution in America, the oil and natural gas revolution. The third is technology. We continue to dominate the technological sphere. The fourth is demographics. American immigration continues to be a powerful, powerful, positive force, infusing the country with lots of young people. So all these things have come together. And as a result, what you're seeing is the United States economy is growing, unemployment is falling, in technological terms we continue to do well, and the rest of the world, Europe is stagnant, Japan is going sideways, China is slowing down. You know, there are other countries like India is doing well, but it's from a very low base, a very, very poor country. So I tend to think that 2015, what you're going to see is a world that is slowing down, but a world in which oil producers, for example, like Saudi Arabia and Russia will do poorly. But the United States, because of its vast, diverse, dynamic economy and diverse population, will do pretty darn well.
You have 3 children. What sort of world do you envision for them by the time they're your age?
Oh gosh.
Yeah, that's a tough
I'm
one.
an optimist. You know, I tend to think that if you look back over the last 50 years, the really important trend lines are that life expectancy has gone up dramatically around the world, not just in the rich countries. If you look at life expectancy in 1900, it was, I think it was about 40 years. It's now 77, 80 years in the advanced countries. And by the way, that life expectancy that in 1900 was 40 years, in 1600 it was about 40 years. In other words, we hadn't made any progress, and in the last 100 years we've made this dramatic progress. I think you're going to see amazing revolutions technologically in healthcare, in biotechnology. The mapping of the human genome is going to be something that transforms our healthcare. I think when my kids are my age, perhaps we will look at surgery as a kind of barbaric practice that was done like bleeding patients in the old days. That we've come up with so many more elegant ways to deal with people's healthcare. I think the information revolution will continue in a dramatic way. For example, education will be something totally transformed. So I look at all those exciting opportunities rather than, you know, there'll be bad guys out there, they'll kill a few people. That's gone on for all of human history. What's new are these extraordinary revolutions taking place.
You have a plane to catch. Thank you so much for being here, and thank all of you for joining us on Writing Out Loud.